so exciting for our commercial producers whom we serve that they're in a marketplace that's expanding and there's a vast appetite for more pork. And we're the people who provide this unique and leading genetic breeding stock to them to start that whole cycle. It's exciting to be in a growing global business, and we're step one in the chain.
Next up is we're going to have Dr. Steve Pullman come up, and we're going to talk about the future of the swine herd for the next 10 years, and we've got we'll get a good perspective on this from Dr. Pullman. And we all know that he used to be the vice president of support operations Murphy Brown LLC, and he retired in 2014. Time flies when you're having fun, right, Steve? And now he's the owner of DSP Consulting LLC, and he works with clients on product development and a whole variety of things. And so I am looking forward to the talk about opportunities in the next 10 years. Steve, thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here, and Jenny, to you especially, thank you for making that trip under sensitive situations. Those of us that have worked with George over the years, we love him. He's like a brother. And I remember a lot of meetings that we had together that we often had healthy disagreements, but that's what makes us better. And so, Jenny, to make that long trip, George would be proud of you today. So thanks for being here. And it's a pleasure for me to be back in Iowa talking about something that I'm passionate about. As Chris asked me to do this, it was mandatory that we hit ribs at Hickory Park last night. So coming off a protein overload, it's a pleasure to be here this morning. And at the same time, talking about capturing sow farm opportunities in the next 10 years. They started me at 20 years, and I said, Chris, I can't talk about 20 years. That's too far for me to even understand. So I left, we negotiated, put 10 in the title, but I'm going to talk about 5 years because that's really reasonable. And I'm really going to focus on the capturing. And to capture, we got to identify where we are and some key things that we must do to make sure, because our herd we know has greater productivity opportunities, but if we continue to use the same methods, we're going to continue to have the same results. So I'm going to talk about benchmarking and talk about industry trends. I'm going to talk about some sow performance records of how they're changing and how they need to be used differently. And then I want to talk particularly today about we have in the business, we have siloed our enterprise. We have sow operations and we have wean to finish operations. The two don't talk very well together. We really need to look at system optimization. I want to talk about the role of the sow farm on total system optimization. And then I want to talk about some of the things that Jenny alluded to as well as verifying and making sure key processes are effectively implemented. To start with, I want to use some data that I've obtained from AgriStats. And many of you recognize AgriStats is a fee-based company, and they have about 1.1 million sows, or about 17% of the market, 8 major companies, and they deliver quarterly results. And the uniqueness about AgriStats is they give both performance and financials. And I'll use some MetaFarm data primarily on the performance stuff in a minute, but I want to try to tie the finance and the performance information together. So very much appreciate the willingness of AgriStats to let me look into their knickers a little bit here. And so to start with, I'll have a couple of slides in this format. Let me just describe, as you look at this information, what you're going to see is the key variable here, and then I've done some trendline analysis, and we're looking at top 10, which would be this line up here. And the reason I want top 10 on there, because if we're having the top 10 ought to be our average 5 years from now, right? So you've got that internal benchmark for your top 10, and then the red line is the weighted average, and the blue line is relative to cost. And notice in many of these slides, you'll see the blue and the red line parallel each other. So We'll just primarily focus on the average line. And then the bottom 10%. And then you see the range in opportunities. So to start with, when we look at total born alive, I've calculated the slope and then the R-square and the percent change. So in essence, we all know that litter size is going up. And we look at that and say it's going up at the rate of about 0.2 of a pig per year based on these 8 companies. And that's changing at a rate of about 1.3%. Now 1.3%, and that's been going on for a number of years. And so we have to say, okay, how do we capture that increased productivity? And is it really coming through the pipe? Are we just getting more pigs and then having a greater percent of those being wasted? And so if you use this trend line analysis and you estimate out 5 years from now, the average will be 15.7 born live, where ironically, when you come back up here, the 5-year is already about there, or the top 10% for a 5-year period. Okay, number weaned. Same format, and notice the R-squares on these go down just a little bit, particularly for the bottom 10. This is gyrating all over the board, but the top 10% are weaning up here greater than 12.5, and the average is going to be about this 11 mark, but increasing at the rate of about 1/10 of a pig per year. And when you compare that number to what I showed you on percent live birth, in essence, we're saving about 50% of that increase in live birth that we're getting. So we're getting increase, but we're not maintaining the average pre-wean mortality with that incremental improvement. And when you look at that, it would say, if the trend line continues over the next 5 years, the average will be 11.6, and the top 10% will be at 13.5. Now, the real challenge is that we talk about sow work, then we have to really say, if you look at sow performance, I often use the analogy of a basketball game, you're looking at the score at halftime. You got to look at the end of the game to say who's winning. If you don't combine the wean to finish performance with the sow performance, you're declaring victory at halftime. And I learned that from Iowa State when I was here. We played football. Well, the first half, now we say that in Nebraska. And so what you see in wean to finish, this is a combined nursery finishing mortality, we're seeing about 0.4% increase in mortality per year. Okay, so we're weaning more pigs, and so the net effect is we're saving about 50% of those that are weaned. So when you look at that, you say, we're capturing about 25% of the increase. And so we really have to ask ourselves, is that reasonable? Are we really making progress? But what we're doing is we're creating more waste when we're making the progress because our methods have got to come along to improve that because we have now new systems to deal with. Sow mortality, I know the other speakers will talk about this later, but the AgriStat data clearly says we've got a continuing problem. The change is going up at the rate of about 0.6% per year, and if you continue to monitor that at the present rate, sow mortality will be at 14.7%. Now keep in mind, that's greater than combined wean to finish mortality, and that's the kind of challenge we're going to be facing. And I know Iowa State and group have been working on that for a few years and appreciate their leadership in this very complicated area. Average herd parity. Jenny clearly told us the components of lifetime sow productivity, one of which is longevity. Longevity means average parity's got to go up, the trend line is going down, okay? Because we've chased the PSY mentality too long. And you know, Jenny, George and I talked about that for decades, about how we got to get off that bandwagon, and we're starting to see, after 10 or 15 years of emphasis, people are starting to talk about lifetime sow performance. By just a show of hands of those that are in production, how many can tell me what their lifetime sow productivity average is year to date? One hand. Just give me one hand. Okay. We got a problem when we've chased the wrong target, haven't we? So average parity is going down. Sow herds are younger, replacement rates are greater. And if I'm a genetic company, well, I say, bring her on. Okay? Now, the other part of AgriStats is to look at the finance aspects. And this is taking their lots of data and summarizing it on one slide. And keep in mind here, this is data from June to August of 2021. And what I've listed is the top 10, the top 25, the average, and the bottom 10, and then calculated the range between the top and the bottom. And so let me just start by focusing on production costs. The average is about $62, the top 10 at 55, and the range between the top 10 and the bottom 10 is 16 bucks, so we're sitting at about somewhere in the range of $36 a pig difference. 36 bucks. And these are with 8 companies. And then also when we look at pigs mated per sow per year, a range there from top to bottom of 5.6. Pigs marketed, amazing progress here. And top 10 at 28, average of 24.6, bottom 10 at 21. I remember when I first started in Extension, our goal was to get people to 21 pigs weaned per sow per year. Now we're marketing more than that for the bottom 10%. But look at this column here, a number that we often don't really look at. But we are producing over 8,000 pounds of pork per sow per year on the top 10%, with the average being about 7,000. A number that talks about system optimization. And then this far column, the combined nursery mortality. One of the biggest single variables we've got is the range in these numbers. And we'll talk a little more about that. So the point I want to really reemphasize by showing you this number is I think one of the greatest opportunities to those involved in production is you got to figure out a way to get key financial information to your production system. They fly blind too often. They need to be able to know their finances. They need to know how they're working. They need to know what is their weaned pig cost, and that information needs to be at their fingertips, and then they need to use that for internal benchmarking. Now, let's shift to MetaFarms analysis. MetaFarms has about the same number of sows. These two market segments, it gives us 2 pretty big sample sizes, maybe a little bit of overlap, but probably minimal. And in this case, I picked up a few more metrics to look at, and their data is only expressed for a 3-year period, so I didn't feel like I could do trendline analysis with 3 years. So what I've elected to do is just do the annual change, looking at the difference between those and then dividing it by 3 so you could at least see what direction they're going. But what's interesting, and you would expect this, the AgriStats and the MetaFarms averages are pretty close to each other. So we really have some robustness in what the industry status is. And you can see there their average is 11 pigs for 2019. And that's part of the problem, is this stuff is so delayed. You don't see it for 6 to 9 months after the end of the year. But the number I wanted to focus on, the average industry pigs weaned per lifetime today is 41. Okay, so keep that number in mind. And when you looked at the data that Rob Knox had in Jenny's presentation, a lot of hers were closer to 45, 50 days, or 50 pigs. And so looking at the MetaFarms analysis as a percentile, now in this case it's a little bit different than the AgriStats. They talk about the top 90 percentile, where AgriStats talks about the top 10%. And so when you look at the mean, each of these are ranked individually. This isn't one system. These are individual sow farms that this data come from. And you can see the averages, an 85% farrowing rate, 13.1 live birth, wean per litter 11.2, 26.1, and 42. But the thing I want to do is focus on the 70 plus percentile, because we're trying to say, where are we going to be? And right here is our stretch target. If we can hit the 70 to 90% and establish that as our stretch system, then that says that's where we ought to be, and then we put methods in it to accomplish that. So use the benchmarking for establishing stretch targets and goal setting. And without that, you're going to continue to remain where you're at. Now, another piece of analysis that came out of the MetaFarms is the distribution of the, and in this case, it represents 457 sow farms, again, about 1.1 million sows. And the thing I wanted to look at was the distribution in PSY. And you can see we've got 6.1% of the sow farms greater than 30 pigs per sow per year. Okay, and so still lots of opportunity to push that to the right if your magic sauce is PSY. But I think you need to look at pigs weaned more as an indicator and then keep lifetime as the real gold standard. Now, let's look at the second half of the game and look at wean to finish mortality. And this data comes from MetaFarms as well. And what I've done here is taken the top 10%, the bottom 10%, and then the average, and then did the trend line analysis. This is showing 0.6% change in livability per year, or about 1%. But keep in mind, this is the worst performing farms are averaging 12.6% wean to finish mortality. The group average is 7.2, and the top 10 is 3.2%. And what's interesting is the top 10 has a pretty predictable up, even though it's going from a small amount to more amount. The R-squares are higher for the top 10 than the other grouping. So my point to you today is when I'm thinking about improving and capturing sow value, don't forget to look at the second half of the game. I remember talking to one of the production guys I worked with over the years, and I said, "How are your pigs doing downstream?" He looked at me, and this guy had been in business 25 years. He said, "Nobody ever asked me that. I don't get paid for that." And I thought, yeah, you are absolutely right, and that's my fault as a leader, because we have not given you the tools to monitor your downstream effect. And so you gotta have systems in place so people can monitor how they're doing downstream. Now, if we're mixing a bunch of pigs up, it's pretty hard to do that. But as we continue to go to shorter fill times, single source, it's possible to give people some downstream effects. More than just go to checking them when they hit the nursery, but they're actually monitor closeout results. So let's change next to sow records. Sow records have been used extensively, debated on their value. I was in a system where they said they're no good, we're going to discontinue them. And just dropped them, and then we had to come back and put them back in place. But individual sow records have been helpful, but have created data overload and inadequate focus. How many of you have received that 20, 30-page PigChamp report, and your eyes start to roll back in your head, and then you go to your 3 lines that you look at? It's just wasted paper and causes focus problems. So it's important to have it, but our delivery of information has been bad. And so I want to propose that we continue to use our sow production records for analysis and troubleshooting to make data-driven decisions, and for internal benchmarking. Again, your best improvement are the 10 best, your top 10 in your own system, because that shows that you can do that in your top 10. But in many cases, we don't look at that as a benchmark. You have external and you have internal benchmark. And we need more run charts, and I call it the 10-second format. If I have to look at something more than 10 seconds, it's probably not going to be captured or studied. If I can look at a report in 10 seconds and tell you what it says and get conclusion on it, you have a meaningful format. If I'm handed a chart or something that I have to look at, say, what is this line, what's this axis, what's this do? It's too confusing. So think about the 10-second format and less of the big reports. Now, here's some examples of how in the past we've used sow records to troubleshoot. And some of this is really about effects of seasonal fallout. And fallout was defined as the number of sows that were diagnosed pregnant that came up open before they were farrowed. So pregnancy loss, post-pregnancy diagnosis, 2 big systems, one of about 60,000 sows, one of about 75,000 sows. And what's interesting is the interval. You see this dip right here. You see an increase in fallouts due to summer breedings. And notice the width of this. So you're looking at a 4 to 5 month window. It's just not July breedings. it's 4 to 5 months in which you start to see this change. And it's not lack of fertility, it's pregnancy maintenance problems. Sows lose litters. And I think back in my days, Jason, we thought sows just delayed coming to heat. Well, it's really loss of the litter was causing us the problem. And digging into this data a little more, here's the entire herd over that period of time. And you can see the spikes due to summer breedings. And then you break it down by parity. And this is where the diagnosis is coming from the analysis. And you can see the P1s and P2s are the ones most susceptible to the dip, which would clearly be shown. And then the 4th, 5th, and older parity sows are less effective. So P1, P2 are more susceptible to summer breeding problems. So Jenny talked about the percent of sows having 3 litters, trying to hit a 70 to 75 plus number by the 3rd parity is a good metric. And if you avoid this kind of problem, you'll hit that. If you don't, you're going to be running in the range of 55 to 60%. And so here's an example of a well-managed herd within that group. And once we implemented some improvements to minimize that, it leveled off, and the P1s and P2s leveled off. And some of that was just common stuff, nothing magic. It's about temperature, feed intake, body condition, all the things that you do but don't measure and don't often look at. Another system, very similar, not as many sows, but the same kind of trend. 4% reduction in farrowing rate that hits you in December, a 1% in this year, and a 3%. And again, look at the width of the dip. You're looking at 3 to 4 months here. So really pointing this out to show what you can do by analyzing your own data to say, what does my summer dip look like and what's it costing me? And going into this data a bit further, looking at the effect of parity, and we all know that there's a parity effect, but in this particular operation, you look at farrowing rate, there's a 1.1% reduction in farrowing rates looking at P2s compared to P1s. And at the same time, total births were going up, picking up 0.4 between P1s and P2s on the average. And then you drill into that one step further, and you look at, say, okay, look at the farrowing rate change of this system. You had a 1.1% reduction, but 9 out of the 11 farms had a reduction in farrowing rate. And so some of them had less than 3%, some of them stayed about the same. So my point being is by diagnosing and doing this analysis, you start to say 9 out of our 11 farms have a second parity nosedive. And then when you look at litter size, we typically would expect at least a 0.3 increase in total birth between P1s and P2s. So anything less than that is a dip. And in this case, you can see that 5 of the 11 sow farms had a biological dip. Farrowing rate was first hit, and then litter size second. Now, the other part of this analysis was then looking at the effect of the sow farm on wean to finish mortality. And in this case, there are 15 sow farms. Their average finishing mortality, 4.8%. And notice you've got 3 farms over here. These 3 farms, 20% of the sow farms represent 33% of the mortality. So when we talk about continuous improvement, we talk about identifying the big leg of the Pareto. In this case, you clearly have your biggest opportunity to improve wean to finish mortality in this business is to say, what's happening on sow farm 1? Why is that occurring? And what's different between sow farm 1 and sow farm 12 through 15? So sow performance on post-weaning, it's the biggest single factor affecting post-weaning performance. Commonly overlooked, not understood. It's very difficult to analyze it and determine it. And there's very few research studies that have been reported, and it requires detailed analysis of your data to get there. Now, in my days at Smithfield, we did a pretty extensive stepwise regression evaluation looking at all the variables influencing it, and 52% of the wean to finish mortality was a function of sow farm. Greater than seasonality, greater than feed source, greater than anything else, the next variables in the stepwise regression 3 times. So far and away, the biggest single variable. Now we know that's confounded with health and everything else, but that's the point we're trying to capture, is to say sow farm is the biggest single source of variability in my wean to finish performance. Okay? Now sow guys need to own that as part of the opportunity to improve system optimization. Now, another example of doing some analysis was with my good friend Ken here at Iowa State, and he did, and his students did an analysis over 200,000 litters and made two major conclusions which were helpful for us, because we wanted to implement a heat no service program, but we just had production guys saying it takes too damn much time, takes too much time. And so in essence, this analysis showed that we could get 1.5 more pigs per lifetime if we have a heat no service, and the best single indicator of sow lifetime performance was how many pigs they're going to wean in their first and second parities, which was somewhat predictable, but at the same time, this data really reinforced that. So my point being is use your records for analysis to make conclusions to support your methods. And then get your data where you can see it. Here's a good example of using statistical process control on number of pigs weaned. You have your confidence intervals, and then you could also you notice how tight this particular confidence interval is, but you can look at that in 10 seconds and say they're doing pretty dang well. And then the other one that I wanted to point out is weekly wean pig throughput. And I'm showing you examples of how you can analyze your data and looking at weekly pig throughput. And I'm calling this a bad example, or excessive variation. And so these are the number of pigs weekly that come out. So some weeks I'm weaning 700, 800. Some weeks I'm weaning 1,100. And what am I doing with those 800 or 1,100? Probably put them pretty much in the same space or adjusting wean age, right? And so then I'm creating this downstream problem because the number of pigs are too highly variable. Now, once we recognize that problem, here's an example of a consistent throughput. This is going to help the system greatly by saying, from this operation, we could get 1,300 to 1,400 pigs. We can plan our downstream space utilization because we have consistent throughput. But if I've got plus or minus 15% coming from a sow farm on a weekly basis, it causes me problems. Now, many I know have moved to batch farrowings. At the same time, I've looked at that and evaluated it. But if I have a large system and can get weekly throughput, I can get lower cost with wean pigs with a weekly system. So here's a roll-up of the entire business, and you can see that where the variability exists over here in this 14-week period, we have 5% less pigs going out during that period of time, and the average, a standard deviation of 844 pigs per week, okay? And that is a coefficient of variation about 11% on a system that should be weaning about 8,500 pigs. So the opportunity clearly locks into here and say, we gotta fix this problem. So weekly pig throughput, I believe, is the best metric to monitor sow performance on a regular basis. That's truly the gold standard. Now here's a slide from my friend Sean that's sitting in the audience from data that he put together, and I'm using this primarily to talk about putting your data into a 10-second format and then make it easy to understand. So you can see that from year to year, they're seeing nice improvements. They show what they're benchmarking against, and they're showing they're trying to hit this 90% benchmark, and they're saying we're sneaking up on it. And my point being, 10 seconds, he can look at that, show that to his group, and say we're on the right track. And then talking about pigs per lifetime, this data is just a bit old, but you can see the same kind of thing as in this data. We were moving at a slope of about 0.4 of a pig on lifetime sow productivity. So now I want to move into the capturing. How do we get it done? And look at this slide for just a second. And this is kind of what happens in the pig business. This is how we advertise our SOPs, and this is sometimes how our SOPs get implemented. And McDonald's certainly has done that. My wife had a cheeseburger there the other day and says, where's the burger? You know, and so that part of the challenge we have is we haven't effectively measured it. And here's an example that goes back quite old, but it reinforces it. Something that's really critical is like a day one pig care program. We know it's labor intense, it's cumbersome, it's hard to get people to align with it, but it's important to get it done. And notice, we introduced it in this time period and then continued to monitor its effectiveness and implementation. It took 1 year to get to the 70% effective implementation. Now, you say, God, that's slow. I say, yeah, it is. It's too slow. But that was with some intense effort, and it was measured. So what does your system look like? When you implement new procedures, how do you know that they've been effectively implemented without measuring it? So the last part of my presentation is to talk about things I think are must-dos to make sure that your system in the south side is helping total system optimization. First, relative to wean age, the Meta Farms data would show the average weaning age is 20.5 days, and pretty tight 18 to 23 days. And all of you have seen this classical work done by Roger Main showing that older wean age pigs give us greater growth rate, greater livability. And so what does that mean? When you sort through all that, there's lots of studies, but what I wanted to do is just kind of bring it back to a conclusion. I believe that optimum wean age today in our system ought to be between 23 and 25 days of age. I don't think we need to go where Europe is today. And I think if we lock into this zone, we got to avoid this 19 to 21 day average and push it up. And you say, okay, how do we do that? Well, you'll figure that out. You got to put more crates in, or you got to reduce your sow inventory, or a combination of both, right? And it costs money, but you will definitely see it. And when we would do this, every one of these that we put into place exceeded the predicted value. It's a predictable financial return, and I would encourage you, if you're really thinking about total systems optimization, quit thinking about PSY and get your wean age up a bit, and you're going to get more pigs marketed, more pounds marketed. You might increase your weaned pig cost, but you'll lower total system cost. Colostrum management, I know Kara's going to follow up and talk about this in detail, but I just want to highlight one message. We all know it's damn critical. We all know it's important to get it done, but how effective is it done, and how do we measure it's getting done? And we also, the part that I want to highlight that Kara will probably touch on more, we think about colostrum being effective for improving pigs' weaned and livability. But when you look at some more controlled research, you actually show it has lifetime benefit. You see those pigs that get the right amount of colostrum at the right time get greater livability and greater growth rate. And so it's more than just getting a pig that lives in the farrowing house. And we've all talked about creep feeding. It's time to quit debating it, and it's time to implement it. And when we look about what's happening is we typically see milk production peaks at 12 to 14 days, very much predicated on the genetics and some of that. But even if it peaks at 15 to 16 days, if we're going to move weaning age out here, the gap between milk produced and pig growth is deficit. And as we have more pigs, we don't need a bunch of more pigs weaned lighter. So if I had if I could go forward and look and say, what would I like? I'd like 12.5 pigs per litter that will wean 15 pounds. And so if I can accomplish that, I've got my 5-year goal. And so we've got to get creep feed in to help the transition program as well. And I've heard all the eater, no eater stories, but it's something that needs to occur routinely and then measured its effectiveness and implementation. Now, sow housing, an emotional issue. I've lived with this. Tell people I spent the first 10 years of my life putting sows from outside inside in stalls. I spent the last 10 years of my career reversing that. And it's an emotional kind of change. And the reality is you're meeting customer expectations. It doesn't give you a return for the capital other than it gives you a chance to retrofit old facilities. That was really the benefit of Smithfield's group housing initiative. Cost a bunch of money to do the retrofit, but it gave us money to improve the system. And the questions have been the same. When do sows end? You know, we hear Prop 12. Prop 12 clearly says one thing. The science may say something else. So what do? You have the European standards, and how much space do you need? That's going to be an ongoing battle and tug of war, and all those things are going to increase cost of production. And you won't get it at the end unless you have systems in place to capture it. I know when Smithfield implemented their group housing program, they thought they could sell sausage to McDonald's for another 10 cents a pound. You can imagine how much of that 10 cents was captured. Now, when we started to look at changes in equipment, we looked at the Danes because they are way ahead of the U.S. And so we did just a group study. We spent a couple weeks. Sean in the back here even went over and worked there for a while. And a couple of things really to note is their structures are different. They're bigger. In essence, you're looking at gestation areas 35% over U.S. standards, farrowing crates 24% bigger. They had more room for pigs. So we started to use some of the European designs, an example of their farrowing crates, and now today are pretty common with all kinds of knockoffs on these. But some data that was collected at a site in Illinois comparing standard crates to large crates, and you're giving them about 30% more space in the crate here, and then that was analyzed by parity. And when you look at the number of wound, you can see that the larger crates were getting about an extra half a pig here early on. You look at stillbirths, few less stillbirths, especially in the older parities. So my point being, we've got to adjust our system to meet this extra production demands that we have, and sow housing is an important component of that. Now, the next can of worms is the farrowing crate, is the emerging pressure. Is that a good thing, a bad thing? I've followed the work that Swartz has been doing. My compliment to you there, Mark, because I think you're onto something. But at the same time, it's about retrofitting existing facilities, isn't it? And then in this case, they're providing this extra space for pigs. And we all know that what happens in Europe lands in the U.S. about 5 to 15 years later. And so if you want to know how to capture, keep looking east, because that's where the emerging beast is coming from. Now, the last part of what I want to talk about with you is an area that is near and dear to my heart. And Jenny alluded to this a little bit with the work that she's been doing with the Holden Group. And I call it human capital development. It's not training. You train a dog, you lead people. And in this case, we're helping people get better at their business. We're not training them, we're inspiring them, we're leading them. And so the whole idea of development is critical. And it needs to be led by management. Not a sales trainer, not a production trainer. It needs to be assisted by HR, but it needs to be management's passion. So anybody in here in pig production management, I would say your number one priority is to go back and review your human capital development program. Say, are we doing what we need to? Everybody knows it's important, but what are you doing to improve something? Because that's what it's going to take, particularly when we're labor short in today's systems. We need to move from farm managers to farm leaders. Stephen Covey teaches, we manage things and we lead people. Farm managers need to lead people, not manage things. And you need to have a structured, mandatory onboarding process. You need to make sure that every person coming in, we know that the greatest loss of employees occurs in the first 3 months of their employment, and we need to get them washed out and need to understand if we're getting them hired right early on. And you need to initiate, I call them quarterly goal reviews, where you really sit down and talk about how are they doing, how can you help them, and to make sure their goals are aligned with your strategic plans. And then you need to teach and certify. Certify meaning demonstrate that they can do it, not that they've been shown. Okay, certify means they've got to be able to show competency in the skill set, and that will minimize the time from introduction to effective implementation. And then you make sure you have modules for leadership skills, priority management, managing conflict, effective coaching. Those soft skills, generally those in SAL leadership positions are long on technical skills and short on leadership skills. And you need to help them improve their leadership because that's, many cases, their weakness. And then you need to facilitate a mentoring program. Have a friend, have a coach, have somebody that they know they can talk to. And then the last one is to assess your incentive plan. If you're awarding on PSY or PIGs or something like that, you be careful what you reward because you'll get it. And that's a real concern in today's world, is that we have sub-optimized because of our programs. We learned a long time ago relative to contracts, for instance, that had feed efficiency in. We got better feed efficiency, and then they complained when we decreased the cost of feed, and their feed efficiencies got worse, but we made more money. So we got to be careful in how we set up our incentive plans that they truly optimize the system. And then recognize this is a beast. And the challenge we have is get started and improve as you go. And then the last slide I'll show is just the effect of retention of employees on Sal productivity, because that's what we're really trying to do, is retain employees. Today's industry, I don't know what your numbers are. I've seen numbers range between 25 and 75% retention or turnover, annual turnover. It really ought to be closer to 15 to 20%. And some of that is the way we lead. And this clearly shows we'll wean more pigs, and leadership and training are usually the challenge and the development aspect. So in conclusion, let me just say, benchmarking is a critical element of capturing the future, using internal and industry benchmarking, recognizing we've got our biological systems are changing. We're seeing increase in litter size, number of wean, sow mortality, wean to finish mortality. All key variables are going the wrong, in many cases, could be going the wrong way. And we're seeing decreased average parity. We need to adjust our mentality to total system optimization. Think about winning the game at the end, not at halftime. And think about the impact of the sow farm on wean to finish, and spend more time mining and analyzing your sow records. Just don't keep them, don't just look at the paper copy and say, oh, okay, we did okay. And then improve your human capital plan. And then finally is embrace emerging technologies logically, and then ensure that you've got a system to verify what you think you're doing is really occurring. With that, it's been my pleasure to be with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Pullman. That was great. You want to? We're open for questions from the audience, and we'll make sure you get the microphone so you get it in the recording.
I was teasing them to say when they throw that box to you, it might be the first completed pass that Iowa State has had. But I can't say that anymore. But it's a good joke, right? Yeah, and we even lost to Minnesota. Imagine that. Yes, sir, please.
Okay. You can hit your matrices, such as your 11.8, 23, 15-day-old pig, or 15-pound pig. But what's your bell-shaped curve look like? How tight is that? Because I find I can hit numbers like you're talking about, but what causes the problem is how many pigs on the bottom end side, they're outside of the variance.
Good point.
Those are the problem.
Absolutely. Great point. And, let me first define improvement as reduced variation. And so you've moved the mean, but you got to also decrease the standard deviation. And so let's use wean age as an example. When I shift that age, I shift the whole population. My standard deviation may not change, but I have fewer lightweights just because the pigs are on the sow longer. So you do have that as a method that helps do that. But you're absolutely right to try to capture the variation. That's going to be part of the system, and we can measure it and do things about it, but that's part of the biological systems we deal with. And you do all you can to say, first, identify what it is, and secondly, what can you do about it?
Another question? Dr. Pullman, I was wondering about when you talk about summer management changes and you improved the performance on a herd, you want to expand on what those changes?
Sure.
What kinds of things you were talking about? Is it condition score, or temperature you mentioned, but?
You know, Dave, I must admit, none of it was rocket science. It was doing the basics better. It was about making sure the ventilation was working. Where we were having some problems is in the middle of the barn where air distribution wasn't adequate. Water may not be getting to the end of the trough or plug nipples. And so what you did is you had a focus to say, we got to avoid these kind of predictable impacts, because you don't see them until that sow starts to have problems. And so in that well-managed system, we had a list of about 8 or 10. And another big one, Dave, I should mention, is at that period of time, we tend to breed anything that stands, right? And so you got to make sure that you're qualifying predictable, good quality breeds. Because when you start hitting a repeat, and you start hitting on some of those kind of sows, that's where your problem starts. And so we actually set up a definition there where we called it a quality breed. And then we laid a definition to that, and then we measured that. What % of the females were a quality breed? Quality was just but what we had was focus on it. And I think that was probably the biggest single factor, is to say we recognized the problem, and then we tried to say we got to correct the problem, and then we're going to see how well we corrected it. But unfortunately, we corrected it in maybe 1 or 2 of the farms because there was commitment there. The others were like, this is just normal stuff. We deal with this every day. I'm busy.
So thank you again, Dr. Pullman. We appreciate it. It's time for a break now. Let's give Dr. Pullman another round of applause.